New Zealand, the remote Pacific archipelago, home of the All Blacks and their famous pre-match renditions of the haka, land of Polynesian warriors, and of the most visible political figure that this country has had in recent decades. We're talking, of course, of progressive leader Jacinda Ardern, that young political figure whom many came to regard as the new face of all global social democracy.
Ardern becomes New Zealand's most popular PM in a century. Poll.
However, what goes up eventually must come down, and that's just what happened to good old Ardern. The COVID-19 crisis triggered other crises in the Kiwi nation: inflation, high cost of living, skyrocketing housing prices, the perfect formula for losing the confidence of citizens, unless of course you're in Argentina. As it turns out, at the last election of 14th of October 2023, this is what happened to Ardern's former party.
New Zealand elects its most conservative government in decades. The rightward shift came as voters punished the party once led by Jacinda Ardern for failing to deliver the transformational change that it had promised.
New Zealanders voted for a new government to end the 6 years of Ardern's Labour government. The country is not going through the best of times, and Kiwis want solutions. But what if I told you that New Zealand faces more than just internal threats? What if I told you that China is an increasingly concerning player for the Kiwi nation? VisualPolitik viewers, what can I say? China's tentacles continue to spread around the world, and New Zealand and its neighbourhood are no exception. Be that as it may, all of this has made us on VisualPolitik ask ourselves a few questions. What legacy does Jacinda Ardern leave in New Zealand? What does the shift to the right mean for this country? What role will China play in all of this mess? And one last question: did you know that New Zealand is our favourite country? Alright, let's get started.
Loved around the globe, rejected at home.
So far, this century, there have been world leaders who have stood out above others, both for better and for worse. Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Angela Merkel, Putin. Well, we could say that this has also been the case with Jacinda Ardern. Ardern, who came to power in 2017 leading a coalition government with the Greens and New Zealand First, a populist and nationalist party, soon emerged as the major flag bearer of what is known as the International New Social Democracy. In fact, her profile reached the heights of popularity in 2020 after having to deal with two crises that catapulted her to stardom. On the 15th of March 2019, the New Zealand city of Christchurch suffered a terrorist attack that killed 51 Muslims in 2 mosques. The attack, which had significant international repercussions, led Ardern to quickly and aggressively regulate gun ownership in New Zealand. In less than a week, she managed to get Parliament to pass a new law, regulating ownership in a more restrictive manner. This swift action, along with the empathy and closeness she showed to the families of the victims, greatly strengthened her reputation, both locally and internationally. However, it was her response to the COVID-19 crisis that secured her a place on the podium of the world's most influential figures. The nation's swift reaction to the pandemic, establishing strict restrictions as early as February 2020, when there were only a few cases reported nationally, conducting mass testing campaigns, and getting the population to correctly comply with the restrictions, led to New Zealand becoming one of the countries where COVID-19 had the least presence and the least mortality. Without going any further, here on VisualPolitik, we gave Ardern one of our awards precisely for this quick response. And of course, due to this very reason, we should not be surprised that in the October 2020 elections, she would have a landslide victory.
New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern's landslide victory in her second term.
Ardern won an absolute majority that allowed her to govern alone. So after the initial shock of the pandemic, the Prime Minister promised to focus on economic recovery. However, the plans would not turn out as the popular Kiwi Prime Minister had in mind. To begin with, at the beginning of 2022, the New Zealand population began to protest in the streets to put an end once and for all to the COVID-19 restrictions, which had been in place for more than 2 years. Of course, that was not all. There were also other reasons for the rapid decline in Ardern's popularity: high inflation, an ever-increasing cost of living, stratospheric housing prices. To give you an idea, between 2017 and 2021, housing prices rose 58%, with the average price of a home reaching $1 million New Zealand That's about 600,000 US dollars at the current exchange rate. Meanwhile, Ardern's promise to build 100,000 new homes came to nothing. The Ardern government, far from being self-critical, tried to put all the blame for the general deterioration of the country on the murky international scenario.
The world is experiencing the worst economic shock since the Great Depression, with the war in Ukraine and COVID-19 related supply chain issues adding to it with the worst inflation spike in decades.
Finally, in the face of popular pressure, at the beginning of 2023, we saw this news.
Jacinda Ardern is stepping down as Prime Minister of New Zealand. The leader, internationally acclaimed for her more than 5 years in office, will step down in February.
Ardern eventually resigned from her position. Her profile had deteriorated very rapidly during her second term in office, and, along with her, that of the Labour Party. Ardern's successor, Chris Hipkins, was unable to reverse the negative trend in the polls, and in mid-October of this year, what many had already predicted ended up happening. There was a new Conservative victory. But who will be the next Prime Minister? And even more importantly, what are his or her plans for New Zealand? Well, pay very, very close attention.
The Conservative Revival.
On the 14th of October this year, New Zealanders were called to the polls to decide the future path of their country. However, given how threadbare the Labour Party was, everyone knew what the final outcome of the election would be. And indeed, there were no surprises. The National Party, representing the conservative wing of Kiwi politics, outperformed Labour by a wide margin. For many analysts, this election has been the final blow to Jacinda Ardern's legacy. But who is it that has managed to beat Labour? Well, this man you see here, Christopher Luxon. Luxon, who has been a major businessman in, among other companies, Air New Zealand, did not begin his political career until 2020, when he started out as a junior MP. However, 1 year after joining the National Party, he became the party's leader. Yes, these things do happen in New Zealand. Luxon has often been identified as a Christian in a particularly secular country. We're talking about a politician who acknowledges being both socially and fiscally conservative. That is, he opposes reliance on subsidies and believes in low taxes and reduced public spending. Nevertheless, contrary to what many might think, Luxon also embraces other ideas that have traditionally been identified with a more, shall we say, progressive line, such as the fight against climate change or support for the LGBT community. Even so, such issues have taken a back seat in this campaign, where Luxon has focused first and foremost on two key objectives: improving the economy and reducing the lack of security. You see, New Zealand officially went into recession in the middle of 2023, so Luxon's proposals have focused on getting the economy back on track by improving one of the country's weakest aspects: its low productivity. Since the 1970s, New Zealand's labour productivity has been stagnating and is now below the OECD average, which has hit wages hard. This stagnation is due to the limits of its two main economic sectors, agriculture and livestock.
It's really hard to get an extra liter of milk out of a cow. It's really hard to get big productivity gains out of tourism. We don't have lots of our economy in areas where there are productivity gains even from small investments, like IT, advanced manufacturing, pharmaceuticals. Those are areas where you can see huge uplifts in productivity, so that's a challenge.
What's more, the fact that New Zealand is among 10 of the most restrictive OECD countries for foreign investment inflows does not help to solve this problem. Therefore, in order to improve productivity and boost economic recovery, Luxon has pledged, among other things, to balance the public accounts, reduce the tax burden, make the entry of foreign capital more flexible, and attract talent from abroad. A very capitalist program. However, Luxon was also aware that citizens were concerned about an almost new problem in the country: an increasing lack of security. You see, in New Zealand and Australia, what we have been seeing in various cities throughout the United States is happening. Burglaries of commercial establishments are continually soaring. In fact, so far, this has cost Australia and New Zealand together about $6.4 billion US. We are talking about a 45% increase in commercial burglaries in New Zealand in 2022, a country that is usually very quiet and safe. As a result, during the campaign, Luxon put special emphasis on the fight against crime. Check it out.
National would bring back military boot camps for young offenders. National announces plan for 300 more frontline police to tackle inner-city crime.
Luxon understood what the Kiwis were looking for. He promised to improve the country's economy and security, and thus won the election. However, many are now also wondering what its foreign policy will be like, and above all, what exactly its position will be in regards to an increasingly present China in the South Pacific. Will there be any change from the Labour position of recent years? Well, let's find out.
With China, tough or soft?
On this channel, we have already talked a few times about the South Pacific region, what we know mainly as the continent of Oceania, and the many island nations that compose it. Nauru, Kiribati, Micronesia, Vanuatu, and a few more. Well, the fact is that this huge area has traditionally been one where Australia, above all, and also New Zealand, to a lesser extent, have had their main sphere of action. In other words, it has been, and continues to be, their backyard. Even so, in the last 2 decades, another player has come into play that has already achieved immense influence. We are talking, of course, about China. The Asian giant has not only become the largest trading partner of the countries in this part of the South Pacific, but has also managed to position itself as the 3rd largest donor in the region, behind only Australia and New Zealand. In fact, between 2011 and 2017, Chinese aid to these countries accounted for 8% of all the official development assistance they received. This rapid Chinese rise has come about as a result of these small, highly underdeveloped islands with a distinct lack of infrastructure reaching out to China and its offers of loans in order to get numerous projects off the ground. In the face of this Chinese rapprochement with the region, both Australian and New Zealand analysts have warned of the risks posed by this development. Firstly, they fear that China could establish military bases in these countries, something that is a real possibility given the agreement it signed with the Solomon Islands.
China signed security agreement with Solomon Islands, alarming neighbors.
However, Australia and even the United States have already begun to react. In recent months, they have been negotiating intensively with all these micronations to improve standards and funding, as well as to refurbish bases such as the one on Manus Island in Papua New Guinea, so that China does not take the lead. Even so, what is certain is that China has been increasingly strengthening its position in the South Pacific, and faced with this, the Ardern Labour government tried to do something, albeit rather inconsistently. You see, during her first term, a relatively hostile tone prevailed in the face of the Chinese advance. Her government published a strategy called Pacific Reset. It recognized the risk of Chinese encroachment in the South Pacific and strengthened New Zealand's investment in the small islands of the region, around $400 million to open up to 10 new diplomatic posts in these countries and carry out many other projects. However, when she won her second election and was able to form a government alone, this attitude changed completely. Ardern suddenly embraced a more conciliatory tone with China, prompted by her Foreign Affairs Minister of Maori descent, Nanaia Mahuta. Yes, Ardern continued to criticize some of the Asian giant's moves, such as the security agreement it signed with the Solomon Islands, but in general, she focused more on reaffirming the importance of China for Kiwi trade. After all, more than 30% of all exports go to the Asian giant.
The trade relationship we share with China, for example, continues to grow, underpinned by our bilateral free trade agreement. But even as China becomes more assertive in the pursuit of its interests, there are still shared interests on which we can and should cooperate. The post-war order and the rules that underpin it have supported China's rise, and as permanent member of the Security Council, China has a crucial role to play in upholding that order.
But with Ardern's departure, her successor, Chris Hipkins, somewhat resumed the hard line that characterized Ardern's first term. Indeed, in several security documents published under his brief tenure as acting prime minister, China was singled out as the greatest threat to peace in the region.
New Zealand warns of assertive China in first national security strategy.
However, this new, much more hostile position adopted by the Labour government under Hipkins may change again with the arrival of the conservative Luxon in power. Many expect that he will adopt a strategy towards China based essentially on business. After all, that is his specialty. In fact, he has already made it clear that he would be delighted to join China's new Silk Road scheme and receive the $15 billion investment China has offered the Kiwi nation. Yet, Luxon will not be able to govern alone, and will have to take into account what are his two government partners, the ACT, a classic liberal party, highly critical of China, and New Zealand First, the populist party led by Winston Peters, who was Ardern's foreign minister during her first term, and who was precisely the one who promoted New Zealand's more hostile position towards China. So you see, VisualPolitik community, the New Zealand Labour government is over. After 6 years. Championing austerity, the free market, and an iron fist, Christopher Luxon has won the elections, and provided there are no surprises, he will be the next Prime Minister of New Zealand. In other words, he will be in charge not only of dealing with the economic and security crisis the country is going through, but also of dealing with an increasingly strong China in the country's backyard. If his government partners allow him to do so, everything indicates good relations with the Asian giant. After all, China is the country's largest trading partner, and if economic recovery is what he seeks, it is not in his interest to lose it. Business and money seem to come first. But at this point, the questions now are over to you. Do you think Luxon will be able to pull New Zealand out of the crisis? Will he become as popular as Ardern internationally? Will he be able to further strengthen ties with China? You can leave me your answers in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on VisualPolitik, we release new videos every week, so subscribe to this channel, hit that little bell so you don't miss any of our updates, and if you like the video, please like it. I'll see you in the next one. All the best. See you next time.